Man vs. machine missions typically fall into two categories: the classic invasion type, where you got plenty of waves with a small to moderate selection of bots, and endurance, where there are a smaller selection of waves but with a lot more robots to deal with. With the community side of MVM, they've taken many creative liberties in establishing more mission types, those being reverse missions, survival missions, as well as one-class missions. While they may share the same wave structures as the vanilla types, they do shake up the gameplay quite a lot in such a way that they do deserve their own category. However, there is one mission type that has been tried that we'll be discussing: Medieval MvM. It was featured a lot in Man vs. Machines, featured just a little bit with Digital Directive, then a tiny bit with Galvanized Gauntlet, and yeah, this was obviously left to dust over the years. But I suppose I should start with what Medieval Mode is. In TF2, Medieval Mode is basically where rather than using guns, people beat each other up using melee weapons. Although there were a few cherry-picked weapons for the sake of medieval times, including the Huntsman and the Crusader's crossbow, as well as a few other utility items. And I say cherry-picked because they didn't give the sniper Girardi, and yet this is the same mode that allows Scout to drink soda. Pissing was illegal in medieval times, I guess, although that is fair considering everybody would just be spamming Girardi otherwise. The rules of the side mode also applies to MVM as well, but instead of fighting players, you fight robots that also fall under the same medieval rules. And boy oh boy is it the worst type of mission ever conceived. Yes, Valve never intended Medieval MvM to be a thing, especially when you consider that the upgrade UI is hard-coded in. And I know that several mission makers over the years have tried their best to make these kinds of missions work. By the way, if you happen to be one of the few lucky people that genuinely enjoys playing Medieval MvM, don't let this video stop you from having fun with them. However, if these types of missions have indeed faded away into obscurity, then there must be several reasons why, right? So then allow me to present to you the evidence that Medieval MvM truly is an absolute piece of dog shit. We'll start by going over the classes. Of the 9 available classes, 3 of them are only ever worth using. These are Demo Knight, Spy, and Sniper. Demo Knight is a good mobber but kinda sucks dick when fighting multiple enemies at a time. Spy completely destroys giants but also sucks dick when fighting multiple enemies at a time, and especially considering that he can't use a sapper in medieval mode. But if you're playing on servers where they fix the eternal reward from being useless in MVM, Spy becomes way better at mobbing enemies. And Sniper is overpowered and does everything with the Huntsman if you know how to aim, which I don't know about anybody, but unless it's skatebots, it's not that hard. He also is an excellent crowd clearer with projectile penetration, which is ironic that an archer of all archetypes could do this, but we all know how buggy this upgrade is, especially if you've seen one of my prior videos talking about it. What these 3 classes share is that they can upgrade damage bonus on their weapons. They are in fact the only classes to do so, and this makes it very clear why they top over the 6 other classes. Wow, just like the PvP side of Medieval. Yeah, except this is MVM, where all classes are and should be viable. All the other classes besides the main 3 are only able to upgrade attack speed and health on kill. This makes upgrading extremely boring, and you don't even get crit on kill either, so already you're moving on over to body and utility upgrades. And why run these other classes when you can just class stack? Scout is very underwhelming thanks to his piss-all damage. People are already collecting money by just running around or just scoring kills at Sniper, and even if you miss credits, the amount that you lose 100% of the time doesn't even matter in the grand scheme of things. Scout still has supportive capabilities with Mad Milk, and it's always useful against giants, so he's not entirely useless, but said giants come very few and far between. Soldier has some alright melees. You can upgrade damage and crit on kill on the Zatuichi as demo, and then switch over to the Soldier to transfer the upgrades over, and it works. But once any bot hits you with the same weapon and has honor bound, the upgrades completely vanish, and you're stuck without weapon upgrades for the rest of the wave, and you have to refund and upgrade all over again. Banners are also kind of alright. The Conch is clearly the best, but you can clear medieval missions without them anyways. Pyro has a back scratcher, but aside from that, every other melee is worthless, and the gas passer and the thermal thruster cannot be used. Heavy's only good melee is a KGB, which allows him to somewhat compete with Demo Knight by having crit boosts, but once again, Demo Knight is allowed to upgrade damage bonus unlike Heavy, so he falls behind. Engineer is an absolute worthless piece of shit, just like in medieval mode, which is shocking considering he is the best class in standard MvM. Aside from not being able to build anything, his only best in slot is the Gunslinger, but why even play as the worst class in the first place? He is unironically throw tier, unlike Scout. Medic is another decent one besides Heavy. He has a crossbow, and he can't compete with Sniper, but once again, Medic cannot buy damage bonus, so he lags behind. He can heal players, but they can just buy health on kill and regeneration anyways, and penetration is also buggy with the crossbow. Melees are just whatever, and you're really just better off shooting rather than spamming the amputator taunt. And that's all the problems the other classes have that make him unpopular choices for medieval MvM. And let's not forget how absolutely janky the melee combat in this game is. The moment you have a ping higher than 50, the worse the hit registration gets and laggier the engagements are. The base melee range is terrible terribly short, every damage you take has knockback, and can sometimes completely screw you over getting a kill. And not only that, all melees are single target only. This means that every fighter is immediately powerless once there are more than one single bot chasing them. Yeah, this works in PvP, but it sure as hell doesn't in regards to PvE, and it sucks! Blame the shit! By the way, there is no such thing as melee resistance, and because robots are allowed to hit through each other, there can be times where you can just get 1-0 in an instant. Now let's talk about the bots. In Medieval MvM, every single robot has been completely stripped down to melee. No matter how different the class is or how weird their melee weapons or attributes are, they will always be considered as melee fodder, and they're everywhere. This leads to a very repetitious and tedious form of gameplay, and MvM already is a repetitive mode. At the very least with standard MvM, the bots have more identifiable traits across the 9 classes and are actually fun and cool to fight, because a majority of them use ranged weapons and behave differently. It's fun to dodge around the burst fires, hide behind cover and taking pot shots at the giant heavies, and flanking around to take care of the medics. And yeah, these missions are allowed to deploy some of the most insane templates because everybody can shoot them with guns. Occasionally you'll run into bots using ranged weapons, but even this is limiting. We know that the huntsman and crossbow are the only ranged weapons considered medieval. Mission makers think this is stale and boring, so they have to bend the rules to make things more interesting. That's not an exaggeration by the by, because by technicality, medieval mode also restricts every single robot to melee if it's enabled, so mission makers have to do some weird workarounds to let the bots use ranged weapons, that of which I'm not exactly sure how it's done, but yeah. In the earliest implementations, there only has been flare powers for the most part, aside from a few unique chiefs. But over the years, they have proceeded to just straight up allow the use of guns and explosive weapons. None of which we can use of course because le medieval. Honestly, these kinds of ranged bots aren't the worst thing in the world. Mission makers always do find ways to balance them out in some way, and resistance upgrades are there for a reason. And sometimes they can indeed be fun and cool to fight, but that doesn't fix the fundamental problems of medieval MvM in general. Since MvM plays like tower defense, a lot of your time is spent walking towards the bots and chasing them around. Obviously, move speed upgrades would give you a much shorter time closing the distance, but it doesn't at all prevent the game from being more tedious than it already is. And like I said earlier, the majority of the bots are melee fodder, so ranged classes are basically shooting robots on a barrel and aren't being challenged by anything. This is especially true for giants using melees. Melee classes have a hard time dealing with giants unless they're being healed, or if they do the trick of meleeing behind them as they run for the bomb, but the latter only works sometimes. In most cases, the giants are usually left to the snipers or spies because there's nothing they can do against them. Because engineers aren't allowed to build anything except their own tiers, you may be bestowed upon the most unfortunate job that I like to call bomb bitching, which is essentially camping near the bomb yourself, preventing any flankers from slipping past. This sucks and goes for all classes, including the ranged ones. Thankfully, some missions go out of their way to put a timer on the bomb, but with these timed bombs comes an obligatory bomb support, and there is always a chance of something slipping by, especially with some of these maps that are hideously massive. So how exactly do we improve upon medieval MvM? Well, for starters, make every single class viable. With Digital Directive's medieval missions, being corrupted catharsis and necromantic nonsense, they do a considerable amount of rebalancing between weapons, as well as whitelisting a few weapons and utilities. Scout gets a couple of changes to their melees, but the Cleaver in particular gets a full crit boost. Pyro has some of their weapons cleave against multiple targets per swing, and the gas and the thermal thruster are whitelisted here. But weirdly, the man military can deploy sentries for a short duration, although the biggest reason for that was the overhaul to engineer. Unfortunately, he still can't build anything, but these missions alter him to be a spellcaster, casting both normal and rare spells on relatively short cooldowns. Though due to an oversight, you can't just stack on top of him and get the spellbooks yourself. Medic has some rebalances to his melee as well, and he is able to use the overdose with an extra firing speed on top of it. Unfortunately, because these missions are from Digital Directive, they weren't able to implement custom upgrades to allow other classes to keep up with Demo Knight and Sniper, and also fell into the more taboo design choices such as class limits and disallowing Spy from being played. The other medieval mission you can get a grasp on rebalances is Medieval Madness from Galvanized Gauntlet. The mission has some of the more modern implementations such as custom upgrades, allowing you to not only increase max health but also build damage bonus, fixing the one core issue that made every other class struggle. It also implements custom weapons, some of them on the more memey side, but hey, this mission allows engineers to deploy buildings. How awesome is that? To make things more balanced though, he can only build mini sentries and they are far weaker than usual, but something is better than nothing. And hey, one of the MvM medieval maps was updated for the workshop, once again offering a different perspective on rebalancing the mode. They decided to keep things simple and whitelisted several things from the standard experience. Scout doesn't get anything, unfortunately, instead remaining as a support. Pyro gets to use all of his flare guns as well as a thermal thruster, Womp Womp for gas pyros. Soldier and Demo get the rocket jumper and sticky jumper respectively. Engineer is not only able to build mini sentries in other buildings like Medieval Madness, but can also use the Pomson. Spy gets the Saber back, and the medic can actually use their medic tiny guns. The only rebalance that was done was for heavy, where he becomes a giant and has double the amount of health as well as his damage output, at the cost of swinging slower. Yeah, these implementations are honestly as plain as you can get, and unfortunately damage bonus upgrades are not a thing with these 6 classes, but considering that it doesn't use any source mod and was solely meant for Valve to pick it up for the MvM update, that is if they want to for some odd reason, it's still better than what we have right now. With these different takes on rebalancing the mode, we can clearly see that traditional MvM rules suck and that shifting towards medieval fantasy is the way to go. The same can be said for mission designs as well. With the missions we just covered, there has been robots using different kinds of ranged weapons, but there are also a few robots that do cast spells, although with one of them it's a bit scuffed in that they can cast any spell. Still though, seeing variety in these types of missions is better than seeing the exact same melee fodder in different flavors. There's also the tanks, which, I mean, what is there to even say? They really are just blue rectangles that you just whack down. The custom tanks in these missions are kind of just one-trick ponies, but they are indeed a step in the right direction. It'd be hilarious if the combat tank gets adapted here though. But that's really it. I wish I could say more, but in my opinion, I still find Medieval MvM to be fundamentally flawed simply because the gameplay isn't fun. It strips away a lot of identity away from the standard experience, melee sucks fat cock as always, and the bots are just repetitious and tedious, and can never be as interesting to fight as their standard counterparts. I am by no means a mission maker, so I cannot offer much of a perspective on that front, but I can confidently tell you that rebalancing the player's tools and making other classes more viable is the only saving grace for an otherwise hopelessly unsalvageable mission type. But maybe someone can change my mind. After all, it's been 3 years since we last seen a new medieval mission, so it's only a matter of time before another mission maker takes a crack at it, and they better impress. And that's all I can really say on why Medieval MvM is one of the mission types of all time. I did want to touch on why we rarely see these types of missions anymore at some point, but I didn't want to include it in a larger project, and so this became its own discussion video. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe! I like talking about MvM, but on the more critique and discussion side rather than the gameplay tips and tricks side. Sorry if I sounded a little mad earlier. I got madness, as you can probably guess. No, but all jokes aside, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you later.